started. So take it away, Dr. Shakeman.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. And it's so nice to see so many families interested in this topic of depression in teens. It's particularly important these days with the stress and of COVID. So I'm glad to see so many parents that are interested in learning more about it and how they can help their kids. So just to give you kind of an overview of what I'll be talking today. First, I'll be talking about kind of the symptoms of depression. And one of the symptoms or sometimes symptoms, I guess, of depression is adolescent suicide. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. And then a related behavior. Can you guys see my cursor, by the way, that I'm circling here? All right, I'll take it as a yes. So we're talking about self-injurious behaviors.
Yes, we do, Dr. Shakeman.
Cool. Talking about self-injurious behaviors, which is often thought of as an aspect of suicide, but it's a little bit different. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then this cognitive behavioral model of depression to help us sort of conceptualize what we mean by depression in teens. And then spending a good amount of time talking about treatments and different intervention strategies for dealing with depression in teens. And lastly, as Laura said, I'll be talking about a couple of studies that we're recruiting for in our lab, paid research studies funded by the National Institute of Health. Some are in teens, some are in adults. So I have one of my assistants, Savannah, who's on the call right now. And so I'll present this information at the end of the talk, but she'll put in the chat contact information for those of you who are interested in being a paid participant in our research study and learning more about kind of the science that goes on behind understanding depression in teens. All right, so just to kind of jump into it with talking about the symptoms of depression, there's sort of two cardinal symptoms of depression that the American Psychiatric Association and other organizations sort of define in depression. And the two cardinal symptoms are sad. One's a mood symptom, so it's a feeling sad, blue, depressed, feeling down. It's kind of like when we think of what depression is, like this sort of mood state of being blue or sad. But in teens, they allow it to also be irritable. So irritable could be this grouchy and this kind of almost like a curmudgeon-y type of feeling where you snap at people left and right and are just kind of grouchy and irritable. And I'll talk about the duration criteria in a little bit. So it's really this kind of negative mood state for days on end. The other cardinal symptom is, while this is a negative mood state, this is an absence of a positive mood state. So it's a diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities. And we'll talk about this symptom in a little more depth in a second. But just think of this as like a deficit or a lack of experience of positive emotions in the teen's life. And then there are these other symptoms that have to occur at the same time as these cardinal symptoms. So you need at least one of these two symptoms, plus these other symptoms of weight disturbance, either weight gain or loss, significant change in your appetite, so just sort of changing in your appetite or your weight, sleep disturbance. So it could either be insomnia or hypersomnia, so either not sleeping enough or sleeping too much. Psychomotor agitation or retardation, and this basically means that you're moving or talking more slowly than is normal for you, so that's psychomotor retardation, or moving very fidgetedly, very fast, and your hands are ringing, and you're talking very fast, and you have a really increased pace of your speech. This would be that psychomotor agitation piece. Another of the symptoms is fatigue, feeling tired, loss of energy, feeling worthless or feeling guilty, diminished ability to think or concentrate, inability to focus, and the last symptoms are recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. So for a diagnosis of major depression, you need to have at least one of these two symptoms, and then a total of 5 of these 9 symptoms here. And the most important thing to think about with depression is really the duration piece. And because these are all kind of normal experiences that everybody has. Everybody feels fatigue from time to time. Everyone has sleep disturbance from time to time. Everybody feels sad from time to time. But what makes depression different is really the duration piece. So the criterion are that it needs to be present for most of the day and nearly every day for at least 2 weeks. So it's not just that, I feel sad once in a while, but this mood needs to be down or irritable the majority of the day. So more than half the day and for at least 2 weeks. And this duration piece is actually really important. We've done a lot of studies over the years talking about, well, the minimum is 2 weeks. For people that have depression for months and months on end, if not years on end, with very little break in between, what we call sort of chronic depression, or what they call persistent depression, is a particularly difficult to treat and particularly important subtype of depression to sort of examine, because it's not just the severity of how bad you're feeling, but really how long it's been going on. That's really, really important. All right, so just to jump into a couple of symptoms in a little bit of depth. As I mentioned before, irritability is this symptom that in adolescence can present as an irritable or a cranky mood, rather than as a sad or dejected mood. And this is a major difference between depression in adults versus depression in adolescents. So in adults, to diagnose depression, irritability wouldn't really count. It's just this sad, low, blue mood. But in adolescents, researchers and clinicians have realized that the mood really can manifest in this irritable, cranky, curmudgeon-y mood as well. Now, one question you might be asking yourself, well, what teenager is not irritable? Well, since teenagers can often be irritable, how can you tell if it might be, a feature of depression or something that's, deserving of more sort of clinical attention? And I think it really comes back to this a duration piece, that, normal irritability is kind of intermittent. It kind of comes or goes. It may be a brief reaction to something specific that doesn't last for, hours and hours, and more importantly, days and weeks on end. But in depression, feeling annoyed or on edge is if the mood is nearly all the time. So like I said, the duration is really key. Like, how long is this irritable mood lasting? Does the team seem to be able to bounce back out of it pretty readily? Even if it occurs, every couple of days or something like that might be more normative. And more about, is this irritable mood present the most of the day, again, and nearly every day for weeks on end? And also it's important to look at if this irritability is accompanied with other symptoms of depression. So do you see, weight changes and appetite changes or sleep changes, thoughts about worthlessness and guilt and some of those other symptoms that I mentioned before? So if irritability is just on its own, that it's not that you should ignore it necessarily, but maybe not, think that this is worthy of clinical attention. But really, if it's accompanied with these other symptoms of depression, that might be where some attention may be paid toward it more. Anhedonia, as a reminder, is this other symptom, this diminished interest or pleasure in almost all activities, is another important sort of feature of depression. And I wanted to sort of draw your attention to this word "or." So it could manifest itself in a couple of different ways. So it could be this loss of interest, this drive, this deficit in pursuing activities that give you pleasure, that give you enjoyment, or it could be a deficit actually the experience of pleasure. So, for example, maybe they aren't interested in hanging out with their friends. That would be this. Or maybe they are actually hanging out with their friends, they're interested in it, but when they're with them, they're just not enjoying it as much. They're not enjoying their after-school activities. They're not enjoying the parties that they're going to. So they're still, quote, interested in, they're still engaging in these activities. They're just not experiencing as much pleasure as they used to. So this would all fall under this concept of anhedonia. Another way to kind of think about it is a struggling with motivation, struggling with engagement in their activities. They might lose their drive to socialize, their drive to achieve, their drive to, do their hobbies that they're interested in, and activities and sports and things like that. All of this would sort of fall under anhedonia, and a very cardinal symptom of depression. Again, the duration piece is key. So people lose interest from time to time in activities, of course. But does it seem for days, weeks on end that the teen has lost their interest or drive in their activities? And again, like I said before, or if the teen is not feeling any enjoyment during activities that they were previously interested in, so their sports, their hobbies, their extracurricular activities, so on. Importantly, I think anhedonia is often overlooked because teens with anhedonia often kind of keep to themselves as opposed to acting out. So like in a classroom, a teacher, might be more attuned to the kids who are acting out or more disruptive, and the kid that's, more kind of quiet, keeping to themselves, again, that is not interested in their activities and has experienced this anhedonia concept, but may not receive the attention in the classroom or maybe not even in the home, because it's harder to attune to the absence of something, right? Because if they're acting out, there's something that you're attending to, right? They're acting disruptive, they're yelling, they're arguing, they're drawing attention to it. But this is an absence of something. This is an absence of pleasure, an absence of enjoyment, and that's a little harder to attend to because it's not jumping out at you as much as things like acting out. Nevertheless, I think it's still important for us to try to make the effort in our teens to notice these types of changes in their experience of in their loss of interest or their experience of pleasure.
And I'm would like to add, I see this a lot just in, sometimes teachers do notice it at school, but a lot of times, like Dr. Shakeman is saying, it's really hard to kind of pinpoint this because part of a teenager's job is to separate from parents. So it is expected that they would be less interested in doing things with you as the parent, with us as parents. But if they, are really steadily decreasing their time with friends that they used to spend time with, or, sharing that they're just not enjoying themselves, or they're just not enjoying school as much, or, things like that. It's, if it goes on for a while, it might not be a bad idea just to sort of have a conversation about that with them, to see how long it's kind of been going on. But I think it's very, very difficult to see this sometimes because it doesn't draw attention. So, we don't want to look for a problem that's not there, but just be attuned to it. If they've just really, you feel that they've retreated from, a lot of their previously enjoyed activities.
Exactly. All right. So the next topic, I think, is one that I think a lot of people are maybe hesitant to discuss, but I think it's still important for us to address, especially with the exploding rates, I should say, of adolescent suicide that we have in the last couple of years. So adolescent suicide is the second leading cause of death among all adolescents in this country. And we've seen a huge spike during COVID in visits to the ER for suicide risk, particularly among girls. It's been identified in, not just Chicago, but really it's a national problem. The federal government has earmarked money in a lot of their COVID relief bills. I think the recent one as well that Congress is debating has money earmarked for addressing suicide, especially in teens. So it's a big problem and a growing problem as well. And so I think it's important for us to kind of talk about tonight briefly. So in terms of assessing suicide, there's sort of different components to sort of suicidal behavior. There's suicidal ideation, which is there's thoughts about suicide, and there's different kinds of suicidal ideation. There's passive ones, which are just maybe things like, I wish that the teammate wished to die or just not wake up. Some more sort of passive thoughts about their own death, as opposed to more active aspects of suicidal ideation where they specifically wanted to not die and or maybe develop a plan or method for how they would carry it out. So for example, maybe they're putting their affairs in order, they're acquiring the needed materials that they would use to attempt suicide. These are more sort of active behaviors and active forms of ideation that obviously we want to pay careful attention to. And also kind of think about the frequency of suicidal thoughts. It's actually fairly normative for teens to have a fleeting thought at some point in their life about suicide, but to really try to talk with your teen about how frequent these thoughts are is very important. And I'm sure you can imagine, a big predictor of suicide attempts is past behavior as well. So whether they've had past self-injury or past suicide attempts, is a big predictor of future suicidal behavior as well. Now, unfortunately, though, there's no strong proximal predictors of adolescent suicide, meaning we don't know when we see X, that means that the teen will assess suicide soon. So that's what we mean by proximal predictors. Unfortunately, we don't really know what those are, despite our best efforts and research and years of study. But we do know some distal predictors. And what's unfortunate, just to give you a caveat before I present this list, that these distal predictors are not specific to suicide. So whenever I sort of talk about this topic, about these distal predictors, they think, oh my God, my teen has something on this list. Does that mean that they're going to, try to attempt suicide? Probably not. But it's just still important, I think, to kind of think about this sort of list in aggregate, again, because they're not specific to suicide, but I think it's still important to kind of go over them. So, for example, things like emotional distress is a distal predictor of suicide. Occurrence of negative life events. So if there's a significant breakup or another stressor, major stressor that happened to them, extreme social withdrawal, increased substance use, impulsiveness, disinhibition, non-suicidal self-injury, which we'll talk about in the next slide, a little bit more detail. And another theory about suicide is that if the teen has if they perceive that they're a burden and they perceive a lack of belongingness, so they feel like they don't belong to anything, and they perceive they're a burden. Burden on who? Burden on society, burden on their family, burden on their friends. If these things in combination occur, that may be, again, a more distal predictor of suicidal thoughts.
And if I could just add a little bit, Dr. Shankman, that's why it's sometimes when I'm working with students that are, experiencing depression, I really do try to encourage them to join clubs or join some sort of activity that is often the hardest thing for them to do because they are experiencing depression, because they have low energy, or, it's just difficult for them to activate, to do things. But that's a good thing that if you can encourage, your student to be part of something, in high school on some level. It doesn't have to be through the school, obviously. There's something that they enjoy, and do what you can to encourage that and support that. That's always helpful. The other thing that I would like to say is that putting their affairs in order, in terms of a lot of the things I see as the crisis social worker, are a lot of notes or goodbye notes. Often it's on social media. So, if your son, daughter, student tells you that a friend of theirs said something on social media, please don't hesitate to contact the school or have your student contact us at school. And I'm the person that they would contact. If they can't reach me, they can just contact, whoever they know, a teacher or, whoever they're comfortable with, as soon as possible. And a lot of the times we do get the majority of our reports really come from other students, and it's very helpful because now it seems like they really know where to go, and they go to adults and then they come to me. And if I'm not available, it goes directly to an administrator. So we have a system, a protocol that we follow. But if you ever hear anything, or if your student says anything, please don't hesitate to contact us, contact me or someone at school that you're familiar with to report that. And then we will research that and follow it up, even if it's a student from another school. So if your student knows somebody from Jones and, that's said, that's fine. We will contact somebody at Jones and we will move forward on that. And the other last piece that I'll say is I think the COVID money has freed up some money in terms of training for suicide awareness. There's an agency called Elisa's Mission, and they have typically done trainings over the summer and at a cost. But this week I've actually received emails because we partner with Elisa's Mission for suicide awareness at Lane Tech, and they've invited us to a free training for staff. So I'll be sharing that with the staff this week for anyone to be involved in a free training for suicide awareness to build the skill of staff to notice these things. So I think that's a great development. Thank you, Dr. Shankman. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that's important stuff. And the last thing I just want to say about this is, I think some people feel, and this is a total myth, that, well, if I talk to my teen about suicide, maybe I'll plant the seed of thought, and I'll plant the thought in their head. And so I shouldn't talk about it. No, I can't talk about it. I don't want to even ask them about it. It's actually the opposite. If you should talk about it more, it's actually the more they talk about it, the more they can open up to you about it, actually the less likely they are to be distressed about it. It'll be this, I don't know, it'll be almost helpful for them to sort of discuss their feelings. So short answer is don't hesitate to ask your teen if they're thinking about suicide. All right, so as I mentioned before, we'll talk a little about non-suicidal self-injury. And what this is it's sort of an intentionally inflicting damage to one's body without intention of suicide. So some examples would be, cutting. So maybe that people would take like a razor blade and cut, their arms or their legs. You might see head banging or hair pulling. And there's lots of functions for this behavior. One could be to maybe get attention. Maybe they're being ignored. They're home or with their friends, and so if they do this sort of behavior, they get attention, and that could be reinforcing for continuing to do it. Another motivation may be to feel something. Maybe they're feeling empty inside, and so to be able to feel something, even if it's pain, they might sort of engage in this behavior of this self-injurious behavior. Another motivation, and these aren't all independent, of course. These could occur. People can have multiple reasons for doing it. It can give them a sense of control over their emotions. So a lot of teens who engage in this behavior may feel that the world is completely out of their control. Their emotions are all over the place. They're just, the analogy I always use is they're like a pinball in a pinball machine, and just getting batted around left and right without any sense of agency or any control over whether they go left or right. So this is a way for them to kind of do something to have control over their emotions. So they're giving themselves a negative emotion, they're feeling pain, but at least they're doing something to control their emotions in some way. And just to be clear, this non-suicidal self-injury and suicide are distinct behaviors. So they frequently co-occur, but they are separate. Again, so the different emotions could be controlling one's emotion, even if it's pain, receiving attention. Another reason could be to stop bad feelings, so that these negative feelings or sadness, irritability, just chaos, and just kind of focusing the emotion on the pain. Again, this isn't an adaptive strategy, of course, but it's just to understand the motivations behind why some youth do it. And lastly, another reason could be to avoid the demands of others. So if they don't want to go to school, they don't go to some activity, they do this behavior, this cutting or head banging, and then the parent or teacher, okay, fine, you don't have to do that. And this is increased where this is an area that I think clinicians and families are becoming more attentive to over the last maybe like 10 or 15 years or so. But it's something to definitely be aware of. All right, so here's a sort of a model briefly to kind of describe this cognitive behavioral model of what we mean by depression. And there are these, as those of you who were on the call last month, we talked about sort of the cognitive behavioral model of anxiety. Now we're talking about the cognitive behavioral model of depression. Excuse me. So there are these four components. There's a behavioral component, such as social withdrawal or inactivity. A physiological component could be this slowing I mentioned before, fatigue, loss of energy. An emotional component where you've had the emotions of sadness, guilt, or emptiness. And then there's the thoughts. Like these are the things in your head. So the amount of the thought that there's no point in trying. No one would care if I was gone. And in this cognitive behavioral model, like all four of these nodes sort of interact. So you have social withdrawal that makes you feel sad, that makes you feel more tired, that leads to more negative thoughts, and the arrows really go in all directions. So one of the interventions that we try and do is to try to intervene and break some of these arrows. So let's try and, if we target the physiological piece, maybe that'll disrupt this kind of vicious cycle. If we target the behavioral piece, again, maybe that'll disrupt this vicious cycle. So that's the way we disrupt the vicious cycle is with the cognitive behavioral model, with cognitive behavioral therapy. And so this is a type of psychotherapy that attempts to modify thought patterns to help change moods and behaviors. As I said, there's sort of different ways to kind of break the cycle. One is to challenge the T, to challenge the thoughts, the kind of intervene here. So maybe you would do things like examining the evidence of the thoughts. What's the evidence that no one would care if you were gone? Let's sort of talk about that and really try to almost debate that thought, try to separate the individual from that thought and try to discuss it in a non-invalidating way, or I should say in a validating way as well, but to try to, like, again, address the evidence of the thought. To maybe modify black and white view to a more balanced view of thinking. So instead of seeing the world as that there's no point, sort of this absolute black and white type thought, try to view things as more gray. Another way to break that vicious cycle is to challenge the behaviors. So one of the interventions that we often recommend is behavioral activation. So this is using behavior action to try to influence the emotional state. So if you think of this, the B piece here is social withdrawal, inactivity. Having the teen engage in activities, as Laura was saying before, engaging in hobbies, engaging in groups, just getting out, just being more active can have amazing effects at breaking the vicious cycle that you see here with these different nodes. And also it decreases avoidance and isolation and as I said, increases their engagement in activities that ultimately boost their mood. The other thing that it does is it has them do positive things to gain control over emotions. So as I was mentioning before with non-suicidal self-injury, one of the reasons may be to give them a sense of control of their emotions. Again, it's not an adaptive way. It's you're feeling a negative emotion. So it's not, you're not getting control over your emotions in a productive way or in a healthy way, I should say. But here with behavioral activation, it's, okay, let's do something to gain control over my emotions in a positive way. So if you say, well, I really like to eat bagel bites. I love bagel bites. So, okay, so bagel bites give me joy. Then what I'm going to do tomorrow on Thursday, when I get home at 4 o'clock, I'm going to make myself some bagel bites. And so you schedule it, you write it down, you put it in your calendar. I'm going to make myself bagel bites tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Then when you do that behavior, you come tomorrow at 4 o'clock, you eat the bagel bites, you make the bagel bites, you eat the bagel bites, you enjoy the bagel bites. Then you did something to control your emotions at a really, really small level, but it's something you have agency over. It was something that you had control over. You did something to improve your mood. And that can help you, again, this gain control over your emotions. And lastly, another way to intervene in cognitive therapy is try to improve the E. And so this is, it's an aspect of behavioral activation, but it's scheduling things that give you positive emotions. So if it's not, making bagel bites, maybe it's going for a walk with friends. Again, it also gives you this control of your emotions, gives you mastery of your emotions, but also just increases your positive states. And importantly with this is that you don't want to wait for the motivation. You don't want to have the teen say, well, I'll do it when I'm ready. I do it when I'm in the mood. You want to try to force yourself to do the behaviors, whether you're motivated to or not. And almost like if you complete the behavior, then the motivation will follow. So for example, when I went for a walk, which was my choice, I made myself feel better and gave myself a sense of control over my positive emotions. And the last treatment I'm going to briefly talk about is of course, receiving medication and other types of biological treatments. So, we always encourage teens and families to reach out to their pediatrician or other medical professional to consult with them if medication would be helpful for their youth. All right, and then as Laura mentioned before, we're recruiting for a couple of paid research studies. So I wanted to put up the information about that here. Excuse me. One is we're recruiting adolescents aged 13 to 17 who are either currently depressed, a history of depression, or no mental health difficulties at all. And these studies pay $519 over the course of their participation. Here's our contact information down here. We're doing another study also that's for adults. who are in similar groups here for currently depressed or history of depression in the past and so on. And that pays $25 an hour, which people can receive up to $600 for participation. We really like reaching out to the community for participation in our studies. So we recruit from the clinics at Northwestern, of course, but I think a lot of folks are interested in participating in science and engaging in the scientific process, and also kind of learning about their own experiences. I think people enjoy kind of helping science, but also kind of learning about their own emotions. And so if you are interested in participating, I encourage and welcome you guys to reach out and find out some more information. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. And for Mr. Nikolek, is there any way that we can have the previous March presentation? Are you able to share that in the chat with us before you go, or I can look it up tomorrow too, because it's no longer on the website. So, okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your help with the tech for this evening. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and open it up to our Q&A. And hold on one second. I just want to make sure that I'm saving this properly.
I'm going to grab some water real quick.
Okay, great. And before we go into the Q&A, I will, say the one thing about planning activities, I think it's